Hey class, for this week's video, I'm going to talk about Chapter 7 and the first critical thinking question. First, I'll say that honestly, after reading this chapter, I do believe that yes, there's a link between media and violence, but I would also say that it depends on several factors. So in the first few pages of Chapter 7, the authors talk about how the history of it, and in the 1960s, when television really took off and became a thing, even though it was black and white, people were already worried about its impact, especially on kids. And the first few pages discussed how in this time period, it was 15, 20 years after World War II, but it talked a little bit about the history of media then. But in the 1960s, there was already a sense of social tension, and they discovered a generational gap between older generations and their kids. And this probably had big impacts on how people perceive TV's influence. But a little bit later, research in the 1990s came out with a causal relationship. They said they found evidence of a causal relationship between TV violence linked to antisocial and aggressive behaviors. And some even made big claims that we would be better off and crime would be less if TV never existed. But others said that this research was inconclusive and didn't really prove anything. The chapter also reviewed a few major theories, and I'll just briefly discuss a few of them. So first was catharsis, which suggested that watching violence and releases aggressive energy and would make it less likely for someone to do that. But the authors actually explain really well and logically why that's probably wrong and not the case. Like if you watch someone on TV eating cake, then you would be less likely to want cake, and that's not true. And then they get into social learning theory, which contemporarily was known as social cognitive theory, and how people learn through things like observation and modeling behavior, and that they learn especially when a behavior is either positively or negatively reinforced. And then they also mention vicarious reinforcement, how when they see someone on TV and a behavior is reinforced either positively or negatively for them, it's as if it happened to the person themselves watching it. And that happened and they talked about this on page 190. And then they also mentioned a few things about aggressive cues and priming and how that leads into reinforcement and social learning theory. And then I also wanted to mention desensitization, which means seeing something repeatedly will make you less sensitive to it, and less sensitive to the violence. And that was page 192. And then I wanted to also briefly mention that the active theory of television viewing section says that viewers, even kids, even kids actively start to make sense of what they're reading. And so that section argues that comprehension is what drives attention, and then therefore that's when people understand and believe what they're seeing, that leads into things like selective exposure and confirmation bias, which we talked about in previous chapters, how people are just more likely to watch stuff that confirms their views and beliefs. And then from a developmental perspective, children's comprehension grows over time, of course, and it's different at various age groups that you look at. But media might actually interfere with this development. And the chapter also mentions how video games reignited this debate on page 196. And I've actually heard many of my psychology professors use this example for that, kids who play violent video games are just maybe more likely to exhibit hostile and aggressive behaviors and in a lab setting or something. And then the last theory I wanted to briefly mention was the general aggression model on page 197, which ties it all together into a comprehensive model. And it explains two processes, but the idea is that aggression results from immediate situations and long-term personality processes and other cognitive factors and stuff like that. So media exposure interacts with individual traits and content and context to shape aggressive behavior. So lastly, to get back to and answer the critical thinking questions, I do believe there's a causal link between media and aggression, but I think it varies depending on a few things. For example, the person themselves, like individual differences. I think some people just have a stronger predisposition or tendency towards aggression and violence. And then, of course, the content that they're watching or context matters. I think it's different watching like a historical war documentary than it is, for example, in our book, watching Breaking Bad and learning how to dispose of a body. And then, of course, age probably plays an important factor in there. I would say this chapter gave me a much more informed view on the entire debate, especially because, well, I just think government and then large media sources often take extreme stances on something, but when they throw in the social sciences findings, it provides a more like balanced evidence. So with contradictory findings, I think both can be valid. It really depends on the methodology, samples, and measures and stuff like that researchers used. But researchers are also people, and people are biased. So researchers might unintentionally lean towards findings that confirm what they already believe. So overall, I think media violence can increase aggression, and especially for people who are already predisposed to it, but those effects depend on who's watching and what they're watching and how they interpret it. Thank you. I can't wait to hear your thoughts.